Well, it seems as though we're live now. We just started streaming live. Welcome, everyone. This is Sunday, January 9, and we are entering 2022. This is our second session in 2022, January 9. We are on session number 24 of Exploring Advent of Divine Justice. And we're continuing on our subject of racial prejudice as we are in these paragraphs of Advent of Divine Justice, reviewing them. We are on paragraph, we started, it was in the 50s.
51 and 52, dear John.
So we started 51 and we're going to review 51, correct?
That's right. We were on paragraphs 51 and 52. That's right.
Yes. So we're going to review 51 and 52. Hassan is going to be discussing a lot in this area. So please also, when you attend this session, also look at the last session, as it's important to look at them all together. One last thing before we start our opening prayer, it's that if you want to view these videos, they're on YouTube and Facebook, you can share them, and you can also save the link that way. So without much further ado, we have the opening prayer. Jeremiah, I see it now. Beautiful, beautiful. Jeremiah, if you could say the prayer for the southern states, please.
Sure. Oh my God, thou seest me in my lowliness and weakness, occupied with the greatest undertaking, determined to raise thy word among the masses and to spread thy teachings among thy peoples. How can I succeed unless thou assist me with the breath of the Holy Spirit? Help me to triumph by the host of thy glorious kingdom, and shower upon me thy confirmations, which alone can change a gnat into an eagle, a drop of water into rivers and seas, and an atom into lights and suns. O my Lord, assist me with thy triumphant and effective might, so that my tongue may utter thy praises and attributes among all people, and my soul overflow with the wine of thy love and knowledge. Thou art the omnipotent and the doer of whatsoever thou willest.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah, for sharing that prayer. This prayer is a prayer we're saying in each of our sessions as our opening and our closing prayers, as we are in Clearwater, Florida, and this is a prayer for the southern states of the United States of America, in which we reside. That being said, thank you, Ehsan, so much for presenting your materials from the Crimson Academy on this very weighty subject, and we look forward to your deep dive on this subject, as you've been so graciously putting all the time, energy, effort, all these hours into making a coherent narrative that we can not just look at, hear, and understand, come with understanding and take away so much more. We can also research these things because of all the references you're giving us. And we thank you so much for this wealth of information, sources and references, and ultimately questions so we can investigate for ourselves. So thank you so much for all of this. And from the Bahá'ís of Clearwater, just wanted to point this out, as this is a second part of a very important subject that we've just started discussing last week, and hopefully next week we'll also cover and answer any questions people have. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Wonderful introduction. So we're picking up, we're studying now the third weapon that the beloved guardian is presenting. So we presented the first weapon, namely rectitude of conduct. Then dear John and Jeremiah presented the chaste and holy life. And now we're on the third weapon, namely the freedom from racial prejudices. Now, before getting into the Baha'i approach to racism, Baha'i approach to racial prejudices, in paragraph 51, the beloved guardian is first starting out and stating this is the most vital and challenging issue facing the American Baha'i community. And the beloved, this is first, before I even start, this is the Advent of Divine Justice. Paragraph 51 and 52 are the ones we're studying. And paragraph 51 is found on page 50 of this edition. And paragraph 51 of the older edition, this one, if you have it, is found on page 28. Okay, so it starts as to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole structure of American society. Reminds me of a serpent, right? This is what racism is it's bitten into the whole structure of American society and latched on and injected its venom into it. And this corrosion and is seeped into it and has caused the organism to start dying and decaying from within. And it is now on the death knells of health. And so it needs a radical change. And the only way that this radical change can be brought about. Now think about cancer. Okay, many of us have either in our lives, we've encountered people with cancer. Hopefully they're not ourselves, but we've encountered individuals with cancer. And these individuals, how did he deal with cancer? Either it's through surgery, they cut it out, or they'd use high intensive radiation, right? To target that cancerous growth, right? And that cancerous growth needs high intensive radiation to kill it, because the beloved guardian says this is a corrosion that is bitten into the fiber. It's gone to the very root. So we need a concerted action, holistic action, to take on this cancerous growth that is eating into the very fiber of American society. And it needs to be collective, it needs to be unified, and it needs to be concerted and active to take on this cancerous growth. So this is the approach the beloved guardian is going to present in the next part. Okay, so next week, the beloved guardian is going to be presenting this in the next part, which is the upcoming paragraphs. But for this week, in paragraphs 51 and 52, we're going to be picking up on the history of race and racism in the United States. Where did it come about? And who were the major protagonists? We've been talking about it since last session, and we're going to be picking up from where we were, okay? Also, interestingly, I wanted to share, before we get into the example of Abdul Baha, which is in paragraph 52, because in paragraph 51, the beloved guardian, he sets the stage. He says racism is the most vital and challenging issue facing the American Baha'i community. He lays it out. He says how bad racism is. And then in paragraph 52, he contrasts it. He says the solution, look to the example of Abdul Baha. Look to the example of Abdul Baha. Okay? How he was so courageous, how he was so magnificent, his example. So paragraph 52, so look to his example. But we are right now really focusing, because racism in America is course after course can be developed on this. I'm just giving you a snapshot overview of it, okay? And I just wanted to take this also personally and show you a few things before we conclude this session today, to show that this is not something happened hundreds of years ago. This is not, many people say, oh, slavery was hundreds of years ago. Get over it, Ehsan. That was long time ago. This is not, as they say, society has moved on. We live in everyone has opportunity in America. But that's not the truth. That's not the reality. And we're going to talk about this, okay? Because I want it to be real and have these conversations, okay? So before we get to all of that, I want to finish up this section. We were talking about monogenism and polygenism. And dear friends, I encourage anyone at this stage that may not know these terminologies to go back to the video from last session addressing these. So polygenism is the idea that humanity does not have a common root, that we as a society have had different origins, okay? So this is the ideas of polygenists. One of the famous polygenists was this guy called Louis Agassiz. And he was a Swiss-born American biologist and geologist. And remember in our last session, many of these major players were very famous, very top of their game. This guy was top of his game. He was a Swiss-born American biologist. He was a geologist, very well respected, recognized, innovative, and he was a prodigious scholar of the Earth's natural history. Agassiz is known for his regimen of observational data gathering and analysis. He made a vast institutional and scientific contributions to zoology, geology, related areas, including writing multi-volume research books running to thousands of pages. This guy loved to write. So his volumes of writing is quite extensive. He is particularly known for his contributions to ichthyological classification. That's fish, by the way. So he was writing a lot of books on classification of extinct species, such as the megalodon, and to the study of geological history, including the founding of glaciology. So Agassiz believed that one species of human exists, but many different creations of races occurred. These ideas have been used in support of scientific racism. So Stephen Jay Gould, that great anthropologist that we mentioned earlier, asserted that Agassiz's observations sprang from racist bias, in particular from his revulsion on first encountering African Americans in the United States. So when Agassiz first met African Americans, if you think about in the 1800s, how African Americans were, they were in slavery, they were in chains, they were often in a state of, and in many of these plantations, they were held in subhuman conditions, and they were really tortured, and they didn't know how often. They weren't taught to read, they weren't taught to write, they were, and so these individuals saw them as subhuman. And so there was a revulsion against them. They thought they were, the word would be gross. And so that attitude that he had towards them was even just by encountering them. And another one of these major players, this is probably one of the biggest protagonists of racism ideology. And his name comes up again in a great book by Ibram X. Kendi, stamped from the beginning. So this is Josiah Clark Knott, okay? So Josiah Clark Knott was one of the really, really, really big protagonists of racism in the history of America. And why we're talking about these individuals is because when the beloved guardian states that racism, racial prejudice, is the most vital and challenging issue in the United States, these are the individuals that were the protagonists to really bring it about. So Josiah Clark Knott, he used early anthropological science to promote the idea of polygenism. So he used the science, the scientific racism, to promote this idea that whites came from one place and everyone else came from another source, another place. So he began to publish on the subject in 1844 with 2 lectures on the natural history of the Caucasian and Negro races, but his theories reached a wide audience of the publication in collaboration with George R. Glidden of Types of Mankind, which was first published in 1854 and ran through 10 editions, supported slavery, and engaged in phrenology. Not who owned slaves, so often all of these individuals also owned slaves and supported slavery, used his scientific reputation to defend the institution of enslavement. He claimed that the Negro achieves his greatest perfection, physical and moral, and also greatest longevity in a state of slavery. Isn't that amazing? He thought this is direct quotes. These are from his publications. He thought that the greatest longevity came from the state of slavery, because he thought if they were outside of slavery, they would die off. They're animalistics. They're wild. So he said when they're in a state of slavery, they're like a animal in captivity. So just like a zoo, they can be taken care of and taken care so they can be the best product they can be. Knott was also influenced by the racial theories of Samuel George Morton. So if you remember the Samuel George Morton, we talked about him earlier. He was the one individual that was the father of scientific racism that was stuffing the white pepper into the craniums, the skulls. So this Josiah Knott was influenced by the father of scientific racism, Samuel George Morton, who studied craniology. And this is another quote from Josiah Knott. He says, "The Negro achieves his greatest perfection, physical and moral, and also greatest longevity in a state of slavery." And that's the one we just mentioned. So this is another one of these per se protagonists of slavery, protagonists of racial prejudice. The variation in human skull shapes that Knott and Glidden depicted is to put in charitably more than what a careful anthropologist would likely detect. As for the animals, the authors perhaps hope to make the visual argument that human races differ from each other as much as, say, a walrus and a deer. The Caucasian looks very much like Georges Cuvier, whose views on races weren't much more enlightened. He described native Africans as the most degraded of human races, whose form approaches that of the beast, and whose intelligence is nowhere great enough to arrive at regular government. So he would say the skulls and shape of the animals of a Caucasian was refined, like Baron Georges Cuvier. But the skulls and shape of the heads of the Negro would be very similar as saying those native Africans as the most degraded of the human races, like the beast. So this is what they wrote and was accepted. This is for Josiah Knott's writings. And they published together. So this is a tableau and this is Professor Agassi. Do you remember the one we just talked about? So this is his sketch and was published in Josiah Clark Knott's Types of Mankind, the Ethnological Searches. So you can see what they thought. They thought that the skulls were originating from the animals, okay? So you can see that the different animal lines were where humanity's variations were coming from, based upon skulls. And this was also becoming very well accepted. In 1844, Knott published the 2 lectures on the natural history of the Caucasian and Negro races, which advanced his earlier argument of polygenesis, the doctrine that human races are distinct and immutable, with separate origins. In the years preceding the Civil War, Knott wrote Types of Mankind, 1854, and Indigenous Races of the Earth. And in both works, Knott advances the theory of polygenesis. Types of Mankind was published in Philadelphia by Lippincott, Grambo and Company. Throughout the book, Knott attempts to create a scientific basis for white supremacy, often attempting to connect his scientific theories to religion. So that's another interesting thing. They constantly back it up by using religion. And we showed a few examples of how religion from biblically was used as a basis for the ideology of white supremacy. In this sense, Knott purposefully aligns his pseudo-scientific claims with obvious political motives. The Caucasian races, which have always been the representatives of civilization, are those alone that have extended over and colonized all parts of the globe. The Creator has implanted in this group of races an instinct that drives them through all difficulties to carry out their great mission of civilizing Earth. So you can see in this two sentences that he's placed here, that it's this attitude of white supremacy, and that it's God has given the white race this duty and gift that is their job to civilize the rest of humanity, to drive them through all difficulties and carry out their great mission of civilizing the earth. So this was the attitude of that was not only in, and he was probably one of the most famous of authors and most well-respected, writing books. And he was, so this became the ideology of scientific racism, and he was tying it with the religion to make it have a very strong foundation. And this became the ideology of the South. So Knott and Gliddon's book promoted this polygenism, the idea that human races had been created separately and were unrelated to each other and were emphatically unequal. So there's no way to compare them. Knott and Gliddon devoted a considerable chunk of their 700+ page book to arguing that African slaves deserved their lowly position. Naturally, the book was a big hit in the antebellum South. Opposed to both shared ancestry of all humans and presumably the Emancipation Proclamation, Knott and Gliddon wrote, "To one living in or conversant with the slave states of North America, it need not be told that the Negroes in 10 generations have not made the slightest physical approach either towards our Aboriginal population or to any other race." So his statement was saying they have not made any advances after 10 generations, made the slightest physical approach either towards our Aboriginal population, meaning to our state. So they have not made any progress after 10 generations. Obviously, they've been kept in slavery for those 10 generations. And that was the intent, and that was their purpose. They were barred from reading, they were barred from writing, they were kept in slavery and did not have any ability to really progress. But that's still not true even then. The individuals under slavery still had a wonderful culture, and they had a music culture, they had food culture, they had a lot of, because that was really what was kept them going. And that sort of unity, and it's very interesting, there's entire courses on it showing the African Americans that were in slavery and the history and culture of those peoples, and what kept them going was that level of the food culture, the music culture, the richness of, even all of that was banned and not allowed. They still had it because they're human. And that was intrinsic part of who they were. And that's what we all share. We all share that. And that sense of vita, in that sense, life, we're human, we have to have these things. And these was what was trying to be robbed from them. They were trying to, and these individuals held on to that. So carrying on, this is, I wanted to include all of these things because to show these are the main protagonists that drilled it into the American culture, this racism, drilled it and hammered it in, that this is how it is, you know? So for hundreds of years, this is the common accepted ideology and why African Americans in this current day are still in a state of relative poverty in the sense of GDP versus their white counterparts is because of this history of racism. Nott defended slavery as a Southern partisan. He addressing the Southern Rights Association of Mobile in 1850, he branded Negroes the lowest point in the scale of human beings, and the prospect of their interbreeding with whites insulting and revolting. He usually submerged politics in his legitimate anthropology publications of the 1840s and 50s, but when sectional conflict threatened to escalate into military conflict after 1860, his publications about race made politics overt. Nott did not remain long in the South after defeat of the Confederacy. He turned 60 while serving in the Confederate Army. He lost 2 sons in the conflict, suffered major professional and financial setbacks, and watched his medical college taken over by the Freedmen's Bureau and turned over to Negro students. This was a huge insult to him when that happened. He predicted ruination of the South's economy. Part of the character of a race, he argued, was its instincts, and instinctively the Negro race was unsuited to free agricultural labor because the tropics where Blacks originated had a more extreme climate than the temperate regions where whites originated. Blacks were naturally less adaptable than whites. This is what he argued. Nott predicted that industrious whites would supplant Blacks in agriculture, and Blacks unable to move north would remain idle and unproductive in the South. An impossible drain on its financial resources, he decided that the South was no longer fit for a white man. So this is what he was publishing in that period, 1844s to 50s in the United States. Nott believed that Blacks had been Blacks for almost 4,000 years, so he showed little patience with the Freedmen's Bureau when it claimed that their character could be changed by comparison almost overnight. And in 1866, he published an open critical letter to the superintendent of the Freedmen's Bureau in which he predicted that the Bureau was doomed to failure. This letter found sympathy among English anthropologists who had a history of disagreement with English ethnologists about abolition of slavery in European colonies. The letter was reprinted in the popular magazine of Anthropology, organ of the new Anthropological Society of London, and many society members were Polygenists, and the magazine editor called Nott the greatest living anthropologist of America. You see that? This is what this magazine called him. I mean, this is an incredible society, the new Anthropological Society of London. They called him the greatest living anthropologist of America. This racist, one of the founding fathers of scientific racists in America. This is what they categorized it, because he had risen to the ranks of being this recognized anthropologist in America. But he was profoundly a racist individual. So these are some of his drawings from Nott: the orangutan, skeletons of the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the man. We shift gears, going to another individual, okay? So this is another one, Houston Stuart Chamberlain. He has the same title as the city I am in right now, Houston. So in his book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, so this is his time period, 1855 to 1927. Move the concept of race now to the political domain by arguing Christianity, ancient Greek philosophy, and art emerged from the Aryan race. So he's saying everything good, in society that we take hold and granted for, from religion to you name it, is all because of the Aryans. This is what his claim was. Even Jesus was assumed to be of the Aryan race, despite his Jewish background. Chamberlain believed that during the Reformation, the union of Greek and Christian strands resulted in freeing the Teutonic strain of the Aryan race from Roman Catholic cultural constraints. Jews, the manifestation of the Semitic race, were considered to be diametrically opposed to Teutonic Germans. They were on the complete polar opposite. Chamberlain's views became the underlying intellectual framework of the 20th century German anti-Semitism and the crimes committed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So this guy, his book right here, you can see it on the bottom right, The Foundations of the 19th Century by Houston Stuart Chamberlain, was the foundation book for Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, and the book that really kicked off the final solution. So this is some more on, and why I put this in is because these are the founders of racism. These are the guys that really pushed this notion of the separation of humanity, divisions of humanity. Houston Stuart Chamberlain, he was an Englishman living in Germany, combined the social theories of Jobonot, the philosophy of Nietzsche, and anti-Semitism in his book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, published 1899 in Germany and in 1911 in English. And in this work, Jobonot's supremacy of the aristocracy became Nordic supremacy race, and blood were welded into pseudo-scientific sociology, upon which the final Aryan race and Superman theories were fashioned. Like so many other races, Chamberlain became a traitor to his country, defecting to the Germans during World War I. He became actually, he was an Englishman, but he was living in Germany and espousing German Aryan support. So he defected from English and became a German. Chamberlain's words of hatred towards the Jewish people were most virulent. And you can see diagrams and texts which imply that Jews were members of an inferior race. And this greatly influenced the Nazi decisions and helped precipitate the Holocaust. Dear friends, these were used by his Adolf Hitler's master propagandist, Goebbels, and to create textbooks and children's textbooks based upon the imagery from Houston Stuart Chamberlain's books to put them into schools. And you can see in the imagery here, this is Jews enter into a Western history. And you can see they're depicting on the right, this is an Aryan, on the left is a Jew. You can see the skull is smaller on this depiction, where the region of the rational thought, you can see they've intently made it smaller shaped so that there's a less, and it's more primate. They're intently these drawing them to be of foreign looking and to making them more animalistic. This was all based on design and intent, based upon their racism. Another one of these individuals is this Grant, this individual. So let us have a reader. Dear Scott, if you could read this one for us. You're muted, dear Scott. Go for it.
The history of race. Similar intellectual framework for racial prejudice against African Americans and American Indians developed in the United States after the publication in 1916 of The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. Grant advocated strict segregation of the different races and prohibition of interbreeding between them. Assassination. Grant's views influenced public policy, and this resulted in racist constraints on immigration and anti-miscegenation laws in 30 American states. which remained in force until 1967, when they were overturned by the United States Supreme Court.
So there we are, 30 states based upon this document that Madison Grant wrote, the passing of the Great Race, and his racist ideology of the prohibition of interbreeding between races. So 30 states passed anti-miscegenation laws so that an individual such as an African American and a white would not be able to marry and have children. So this was overturned in 1967. And even after 1967, there were still states that either informally and were still not allowing miscegenation, and they were not allowing it to families to even carry on normal life. So this is from Madison Grant. This is the individual we were just talking about. The intelligence and ability of a colored person are in pretty direct proportion to the amount of white blood he has. And most of the positions of leadership, influence, and prominence in the Negro race are held not by real Negroes, but by mulattoes, many of whom have very little Negro blood. So Ab's saying that if a Negro has accomplished anything, done anything, it's because they have white blood in them. It's not because, anything they may have done themselves. It's because they may have had white blood. So this shows the absolute racist ideology that these individuals during this period have bought into. They have not only accepted, but internalized. And then they are the promoters. They're writing books, they're writing scripts. Like, as I mentioned, this person wrote this manuscript, The Passing of the Great Race, and it was accepted in the government, and laws were passed that was kept for more than 60, 70 years. So it wasn't just these zoologists and botanists and you name it, individuals that were protagonists of racism. It was also presidents. And so I just wanted to share that he was at all strata in society. President Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson described the Black people as follows. They seem to require less sleep. A Black after hard labor through the day will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up till midnight or later, though knowing he must be out with the first dawn of the morning. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome. But this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought, which prevents their seeing a danger till it be present. When present, they do not go through it with more coolness or steadiness than the whites. They are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient, those numberless afflictions which render it doubtful whether heaven has given life to us in mercy or in wrath, are less felt and sooner forgotten with them. In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection. Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites, in reason much inferior. As I think one Black could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. So this is one of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. This is one of the founding fathers. This is what the country's was written and founding Thomas Jefferson. He's got a coin or note, right? Very important person. stating that blacks are inferior to the whites. Another one of the founding fathers of the United States, an individual less known, but still a founding father, was Benjamin Rush. And he was a physician. He proposed that being black was a hereditary skin disease, which he called Negroidism, and that it could be cured. Rush believed non-whites were really white underneath, but they were stricken with a non-contagious form of leprosy, which darkened their skin color. Rush drew the conclusion that whites should not tyrannize over blacks, for their disease should entitle them to a double portion of humanity. However, by the same token, whites should not intermarry with them. For this would tend to infect posterity with the disorder. Attempts must be made to cure the disease. So he didn't, he was saying, yeah, we should have pity on these individuals, but he was still classifying blacks as being diseased. And so this was, again, a promotion of racist hatred by saying that this being black, being African-American was having this disease. And so this was, and he was a founding father, one of the founding fathers of the United States. One of the prominent ministers, this is Samuel Stanhope Smith. He was an American Presbyterian minister and author of the essay on the causes of variety of complexion and figure in the human species in 1787. I remember one of my friends said, Ehsan, why do all these ministers get into other things? Can't they just stick to the Bible? Why are they getting into, all these other racist things? And I was like, yeah, I guess they had some time on their hands. But yeah, so this minister got into this subject of getting into the causes of variety of complexion and figure in the human species. He claimed that Negro pigmentation was nothing more than a huge freckle that covered the whole body as a result of an oversupply of bile, which was caused by tropical climates. So, interesting theory by this American Presbyterian minister. And bile, according to the back in the day, it's not considered a good thing. And so there was, he could have said it was melanin, but they hadn't discovered melanin back then. But he said bile on purpose. Bile is coming from the bile, the gallbladder, bile, the bile duct, and all of that. And that is considered evil. It's considered proud, arrogance, all of the worst things in a person is the bile. And so that is coming, and he's saying the whole body is now covered in it. So it's saying they're pretty much evil. They're evil individuals. This is the American Presbyterian minister. Now, again, Ibram X. Kendi's great book, and I encourage everyone to find a copy, Stamped from the Beginning. One of the founding protagonists of American racial prejudice is this guy, Cotton Mather. 17th century, America's foremost minister. This is America's foremost minister and intellectual. He preached that Africans were not cursed, as opposed to this guy. He said they were cursed. Okay, so this guy, he said they were not cursed, but instead sent to the Americas by God for the purpose of their enslavement. Oh my God, this is what he said. He said that Africans were sent by God to the Americas for the purpose of whites to enjoy the enslavement of them. This is what he said. It was a responsibility of whites, according to Mather's divine mandate, to teach Africans the gospel and save their white souls from their black skin. And to teach Africans the gospel and save their, I guess they're black souls, not their white souls. Sorry about that, that's a typo. But save their souls, right? So that's what he was preaching. He was preaching that the only way that a black person, the only thing that a black person could do was to come to America and be used for enslavement. That's why they were born into this world, was to be a slave, to be enslaved. This was Cotton Mather, and he was America's foremost minister and intellectual. So this is the history, dear friends, and you can read this. And Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stand from the Beginning, I mentioned it several times. He has done a phenomenal job of collating the major protagonists of racial prejudice historically, and brought them into a very easy reading. And I encourage you to get a copy. While the historical reason for slavery has been largely economic. Now, we're transitioning into slavery and racism. Each one of these subjects are huge, whole courses. And there's actually a wonderful course put out by Yale, and it's on YouTube. And it shows from Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, all the way to present, okay? And it's a free course, it's online. All you have to do is Google Yale course, Reconstruction to present, okay? And it's an incredible course, and you learn the history of African Americans, what they have gone through at different stages. From the right after they supposedly get their freedom. And I just want to share this snippet. There's an incredible, I think I've said it 4 times, Netflix documentary called 13th, okay? And I don't know if you've seen it, and if you haven't seen it, watch it again. And the reason is because that shows you, dear friends, what happened after the 13th Amendment was passed. And why they put that loophole in there, that's saying that if, granted, yeah, all Americans, all 4 million of them, the enslaved peoples are free. But what happens if they had the category as a criminal? If they were called a criminal, that means they are not free. They cannot be free. They do not have the rights of citizenship. So that's when they started really rounding up en masse and for making up charges against African Americans to put in prisons. And then the entire prison industrial complex in the United States was developed to ensure that African Americans were put into prison. And I encourage you to watch 13th, because that will really educate you on this situation where the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the prisoners are in prison in the United States. And the reason is because of a profiteering of African Americans in prison. It's very educational. I encourage you to learn from that. While the historical reason for slavery has been largely economic in modern times, and in some countries such as the United States, where the country has been founded on liberal views, biological racism has been used to justify slavery. And throughout this presentation, last session, this session, we've talked about the fallacy of the idea of this biological racism and the origins of it. However, the legal liberation of slaves in the United States has largely not addressed the conscious, but more importantly, this unconscious racism of white Americans against Blacks, as well as Native Americans. And really, dear friends, this presentation is so limited and would be 20 parts long if I wanted to get into all the different variations of racism. We're just touching on the main one that the beloved guardian touched on, which is African Americans and whites in this country. not talking about Native Americans and what happened to the Chinese Americans in this country and the Japanese Americans in this country, you name it, every population. We're just, targeting this specific one. And the reason is, and I truly believe this, if we get this truly tackled between African Americans and whites in this country, really understand it and come together, all the other ones will be so much easier. So much easier, because this is per se the bedrock of where it says the corrosion of which for well nigh over a century has set in. So if we get this, work the rust off and really clean this and establish a strong foundation here of love, all the other ones will know what the tools are to bring all the groups in love together. So this is the words the beloved guardian uses is ingrained prejudice. Ingrained, it means it's in the very fibers. So this is something I want you to understand. This is how very ingrained it is. The good ship Jesus, this is the very first boat that came to the Americas with slaves on it. The name was Jesus of Lubeck. This was the first ship. So you see how religion was tied with the first slave ship. This is the very first slave ship to enslave African Americans. It was called Jesus. As it was a 700-ton ship purchased by King Henry VIII from the Hanseatic League, a merchant alliance between the cities of Hamburg and Lubeck in Germany. 20 years after its purchase, the ship, in despair, was lent to Sir John Hawkins by Queen Elizabeth. Hawkins was a cousin of Sir Francis Drake and was granted permission from Queen Elizabeth for his first voyage in 1562. He was allowed to carry Africans to the Americas with their own free consent. And he agreed to this condition. Hawkins had a reputation for being a religious man who required his crew to serve God daily and to love one another. Sir Francis Drake accompanied Hawkins on this voyage and subsequent others. Drake was himself devoutly religious. Services were held on board twice a day. And off the coast of Africa, near Sierra Leone, Hawkins captured 300 to 500 slaves, mostly by plundering Portuguese ships. And I actually found a funny but extremely sad comment. Right? He took pause breaks to go and do his religious services during the period he was capturing these people. So he would capture, 100 people, and then he would it's tiresome, so I'm going to go and have my religious break. You see how his faith was so intertwined. He thought he was doing God's work. This is what they believed internally. They truly believed they were doing God's work by civilizing the savages. They thought they were civilizing the savages, mostly by plundering Portuguese ships, but also through violence and subterfuge, promising Africans free land and riches in the New World. He sold most of the slaves in what is known as the Dominican Republic. He returned home with a profit and ships laden with ivory, hides, sugar. And this guy was responsible for the start of the slave trade to the Americas. And the first one I just wanted you to know was called Jesus of Lubeck. So this Christian ship in the name of Jesus Christ was the first slave ship. So this started the slave trade. Slavery began in America when these African slaves were taken to the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, 1619. The African slaves proved more cost-effective and abundant than poor European servants. And as a result, enslaving Africans became an acceptable and attractive practice during the 17th and 18th centuries. According to some estimates, around 6 to 7 million Black slaves were imported into North America during this period. Most of them worked on the tobacco, rice, indigo plantations of the southern coast of America, as well as the sugar plantations. I live in a city called Sugar Land, and the entire city was on sugar plantations. here in Texas. So yeah, this is the major economy of these areas. So here's a diagram of how they would sardine these African Americans, literally pack them into these slave ships, so that to maximize the number of enslaved Africans into these ships. It's not like they cared if they lived on, but they just wanted to maximize the amount of, in their words, cargo. Here's more. These were they were very scientific. These are stowage of the British slave ship Brooks under the regulated slave trade, showing how they stacked them in the diagram, and then showing the different segments of the ship and how they put them into all different areas of the ship. It must have been so extremely tough being, living in that for months at sea. And so this is even more incredible. This is modern photography. So this is not like, oh, Esson, this was like hundreds of years ago. We're talking about slavery. This is modern photography. This is an actual photograph. Now, photography has come, all the way up. This is an actual photography of slave ships. This is showing how these children and people were using these slave ships and transporting slaves. And these pictures are widely available online. And so you could see how terrible this attitude of modern slave ships was, how long they were going on for. So you can see this is a picture of the old books. This is 1864. This is, more than 100 years ago. And how they were attaching them to the hatch of the ship, chaining them. This is a group of slave children on board of the ship called Daphne. This is under the main floor. This is in the slave quarters, and this prisoner is being whipped. And they would often do that just to bring order. Here's another. These are drawings, depictions, being chained. I put these in, dear friends, to show the gravity of this Atlantic slave trade, where millions of individuals transported to this land. This is really what it looked like. It literally looked like that. Just it looks like coffins of individuals stacked against each other. This is another rare photograph of a slave ship, 1882. This is what it looked like. They were transporting slave trade. And you can see that this is not just happening in slave trade going to North America. There were slave trades going to the Middle East, going to Iran and other parts of the world. So there were slave trades happening, going all around the world. So this is why this individual looks like he's wearing Arabian attire here. You see this? So yeah, they were transporting individuals all over the world, whether it was from different areas to here or there. This is part of business. This is a sales market in the United States, an illustration depicting slaves, a sale of slaves here. And she is not happy because her daughter is about to be separated from her. This is a man, he's sitting, you can see him sitting right there, outside a building used as a slave market, bearing a sign saying auction and Negro sales right there. This is in Atlanta, Georgia, 1864. So this is right in the heart of the town square of Atlanta, Georgia, was the auction and Negro sales. For your information, just because we're talking about an auction and Negro sales, the first market in the United States, way before Wall Street, the first market in the United States was a slave market, and that was on Wall Street. That was the original market, was the trading of slaves in the United States. So that was, and you can look that up, that's also an interesting factoid. It was the trading of slaves was the first market in the United States, main market. This is also interesting. To combat the high rate of death among the slaves, the plantation owners demanded the females start having children at 13 years old. By 20, the enslaved women would be expected to have about 5 children. And as an inducement, plantation owners promised freedom for enslaved females once she bore 15 kids. Yeah. So they would induce them and force them and often rape them, and so that they would have more and more and more children, and often they would die, or either of disease or problems giving birth, and they were just considered produce or products, and just to ensure the ranch owner, the plantation owner would make more and more money off the product. So here's a picture of a plantation. This is a sweet potato plantation, 1862. Now, there was many different types of, I would say, torture methods that they would employ to keep slaves in line. Because many a time, there was one question one of the friends asked me. They were like, Ehsan, why didn't they just revolt or fight back? There's millions of them. Why didn't I just fight back? And I say, yeah, they did. Many places they fought back and they tried. But they used not only physical beatings, but they also employed psychological torture. And one of the methods of psychological torture was the lynchings. The lynchings were public hangings, so it induced fear, big time induced fear. And so they would be right up on the tree, and so everyone would gather and they would see this spectacle, and it would create great fear. And you created what's called learned helplessness. You can't do anything. So you cannot move up in society. If you speak out, you're going to be immediately beaten or lashed or whatever. And eventually you give in. There's nothing that you could do. So moving on, dear friends, these are all very hard subjects to talk about. And this is part of the history of the United States, part of the culture that was created from this racist history. The movement to abolish slavery began in the North after the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The advocates of abolition linked the oppression of African Americans to the oppression they suffered under British rule. Some abolition activists considered slavery as a sin, while others argued against its cost effectiveness. The movement against slavery gained momentum from the 1830s to the 1860s, and Northern abolitionists believed that if they could stop the spread of slavery, they could end the practice altogether. So there were some incredible abolitionists that really fought hard, tooth and nail, and gave their lives even in the fight against slavery. One of them, his name was, I believe his last name was John. The first name is escaping me, and he totally fought and gave his life as an abolitionist, and they came and hung him and burned him. And they didn't want any existence of him left. He was such a powerhouse against slavery. So there was not just using this scientific racism and preachers and politicians and you name it. They would make it was so entrenched and part of the culture that it was in the media, it was in cartoons, it was in the toys, it was in every part of society, was this acceptance of this ideology. So it says, this is a depiction. It says, back to the slave quarters. And this is Abraham Lincoln. It says, no nation can endure half slave and half free. Vote no on segregation, February 29th. And so it's saying, vote no on segregation. Shall St. Louis be the slave master? So it's saying, vote no on segregation. So who is Abraham Lincoln? One of America's greatest presidents, right? The founder, Emancipation Proclamation, credible individual, the one that brought over 4 to 5 million enslaved people their freedom. So in this presentation, my job is to share the history. I'm not trying to denigrate or belittle or shed a bad light on anyone. That's not my purpose. It's just to show it is what it is, right? So Abraham Lincoln was a willing servant of that foundational racism. He was a willing servant of that foundational racism. Several years before he became president, in his famous debate with Senator Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln demonstrated that he operated out of a strong version of the white racist frame. For example, he argued in that debate that the physical difference between the races was insuperable, cannot change it, insuperable. I am not, nor ever have ever been in favor of the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters of the free Negroes or jurors or qualifying them to hold office or having them marry with white people. I, as much as any other man, am in favor of the superior position being assigned to the white man. Soon to be called the Great Emancipator because of his 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had made his white supremacist views clear, and his racist framing would later be cited by Southern officials many times, including in their 1960s struggle to protect Jim Crow segregation against civil rights demonstrators. They are still quoted by whites, especially in supremacist groups today. And one reason is clear. They reflect in some ways a deeply held white racist framing of African Americans as inferior to whites that is still all too commonplace. So this is from his speech, and you can look it up. These are all direct quotes. There is a physical difference between the white and the black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together. While they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. This is from Abraham Lincoln. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. So even though he did this Emancipation Proclamation, he was not under any pretense doing it out of his goodwill or good heart to benefit African Americans. He was not doing that. So why did he do it? We'll find out. And this is again from Abraham Lincoln. Does the Declaration of Independence apply to people of color? This is Abraham Lincoln. I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. So to declare all men equal was really in regards to whites. This Abraham Lincoln is saying, did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity, saying whites are under no pretense equal to blacks. But what happened? January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued an order to end slavery and to free millions of slaves. These are enslaved Africans that had been brought over from Africa. The emancipation occurred with the adoption of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War in 1865. And I again urge you to watch that documentary on Netflix. It's called 13th, okay? Former slaves were recognized as citizens of the United States. And in the 14th Amendment, they received constitutional protection. And in the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. However, significant political changes did not change racism and discrimination towards African Americans. Now we're getting into why did he do that? Why did he pass this Emancipation Proclamation? Which he, in his heart, he didn't believe in equality. He said it in multiple speeches. He didn't believe in it. So why would he free them? For what reason? Lincoln described it as a fit and necessary war measure. It was for purpose of war. He wanted the North to win the war. It was fit and necessary war measure for suppressing the said rebellion. Freed slaves in rebel states controlled by the Union were about 50,000. He did not free the slaves in the border states. So he didn't free all the slaves initially, which were 500,000, or formerly Confederate slaves, 300,000. So he didn't initially free all the slaves. He did it in parcels during that period. They allowed slaves in the Confederate states. This is what he did. He allowed slaves in Confederate states to run away and join the Union Army. So this is what he enacted. He said any of the slaves in the border states or the formerly Confederate states, over 800,000 of them, they could run off and come to the Union Army. So this is the official document, very beautiful and colorful, the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union and Confederate troops clash at the Battle of Franklin in Tennessee, 1864. This is one of the famous historic battles. The Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for African Americans to fight for their freedom. Now they could, for the first time, they're really genuinely fighting tooth and nail for their freedom. Lincoln declared in the proclamation that African Americans of suitable condition, so they have to be of a certain condition, has to be suitable, would be received into the armed service of the United States. 5 months after the proclamation took effect, the War Department of the United States issued General Orders number 143, establishing the United States Colored Troop. By the end of the war, over 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army and Navy. It's really one of the major reasons why the North won. It was because of the African Americans entering into the war. Abraham Lincoln considered the Emancipation Proclamation the crowning achievement of his presidency. This is what he wrote. Heralded as the savior of the Union, President Lincoln actually considered the Emancipation Proclamation to be the most important aspect of his legacy. He writes, I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right. than I do in signing this paper, he declared. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. So this is what he wrote. He says, if there was ever something more right than signing this paper, this is what he wanted to be known for. And history now recognizes this is one of his greatest acts is the Emancipation Proclamation. But all the things I covered before, the legacy of what he did before, has not many people know about that. And so that's why I wanted to share that, to give a more fuller history. So I just wanted to share this also. So after the war, there was a period where now there was reparations. The African Americans were entitled to reparations. And so I wanted to share this video so you can learn about this. Okay, here we go.
The months following the Civil War and the start of Reconstruction offered African Americans in the South hope for equality. It also offered the possibility of owning land. Within months, African Americans would be betrayed by a harsh reality. You probably heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. Here's what happened. In January 1865, a meeting in Savannah, Georgia, between Union military leader General William Tecumseh Sherman and a group of 20 Black ministers resulted in a plan to redistribute confiscated and abandoned Confederate land from South Carolina to Florida. They called the land Sherman's Reserve. Newly freed slaves would be allocated 40 acres of land along with a mule. The phrase, which became well known even then, spread quickly. The plan had the potential to revolutionize race relations in the South and the economic future of the African American community.
The significance about formerly enslaved being given the land that they had actually worked was that they would be able to generate wealth as well as create wealth generationally.
By the summer of 1865, thousands of Black families had settled on portions of the Sherman Reserve and were excited to plot their futures. But later that year, as part of his Reconstruction plan, actually intended to appease the former Confederacy, President Andrew Johnson abruptly canceled the order, giving the land back to its previous owners.
The United States had the opportunity to make it possible for the formerly enslaved people to be economically independent, and the country failed to do it.
That initial meeting more than 100 years ago between General Sherman and Savannah's leading Black ministers was historic. At least for a brief moment in history, the opinion of Black leaders had led directly to a radical public policy initiative. Remarkably, over a century and a half later, on June 19, 2019, the House of Representatives held a hearing on H.R. 40, a bill named in honor of the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule. The bill would establish a commission to study the concept of reparations for slavery and Jim Crow segregation, including the merits of a formal apology by the United States government.
So there you go. This is a brief history to give you on 40 acres and a mule, the history of the attempt at reparations in this country and what transpired. So on December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. It said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But what happened? Andrew Johnson was already working against it. This is the soon-to-be incoming president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The president's plan of Reconstruction put power back into the hands of the South's old white leaders and it gave African Americans no civil or political rights. Soon, every Southern state passed laws that discriminated against Blacks. The laws were called Black Codes. They made it a crime for any Black person to refuse to sign a contract to labor on white plantations, and they gave African Americans no voice in government. Soon, outbreaks of violence against Blacks were taking place. At a riot in New Orleans, 34 Blacks and 3 whites who stood with them were killed. Some whites put masks over their faces and began terrorizing and killing Black people. They were members of a newly formed hate organization. They were called the Ku Klux Klan. And they didn't have the courage to show their faces. It turned out that President Andrew Johnson shared some of their beliefs. And in letter after letter, he exposed his prejudices. In he wrote, "This is a country for white men. And by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." And in bottom, this is from Andrew Johnson. This is another one of his quotes. He says, "If Blacks were given the right to vote, that would place every splay-footed, bandy-shanked, humpbacked, thick-lipped, flat-nosed, woolly-headed, ebon-colored in the country upon an equality with the poor white man." So there we are, dear friends. Yet another one of our great presidents tarnished with the stain of racism. So this is the country of the United States of America. You can see president after president. And now we go all the way to president. You can see on the left being beaten with the whip. And on the right, this is the recent shooting that happened where that individual in Kenosha was shot many times in the back. So you can see this is not just a historical problem. Current day, this is going on. This is a current problem. And before we exit out of this issue of racism and enter into the transitionary, where the beloved guardian, paragraph 52, transitions and wants to set the stage and say, yeah, the most vital and challenging issue facing the American Baha'i community is this racial prejudice. And now look at the example of Abdu'l-Baha when he shows paragraph 52. Before we get to there, I want to show you some things also. This is a quote that from Zora Neale Hurston, very lovely quote. She says, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It is beyond me." I love it. It's so beautiful because it's so true, you know? How can anyone deny the beauty of another soul? That beauty that is in their inner heart, and we're denying them. Think of the millions of people that we have hurt in the sense of the humanity. What humanity has done to humanity? Loss of life, suffering, pain, hurt, and all the inner gems that we've lost, the great minds, the inventions, what we have lost because of, frankly, humanity's stupidity. This is the reality. This is a very wonderful cartoon I came across, but it's true. And we're just approaching next weekend is the Martin Luther King Day. So I thought this was so apropos, as they say. And it shows the justice system is for whites. It is equal. And then there's Martin Luther King, the dream, but the recurring nightmare. United States just walking blindly into when it comes to racial justice. This is another quote I really loved. "Racism is so American that when you protest it, people think you're protesting America. If you protest against racism, people think you're protesting America. It's like, are you un-American? Why are you protesting?" And it's like, what are you doing? Because they think it's so part and parcel of how it is in America. And as also Martin Luther King Day celebration is coming up next weekend, this is another wonderful one of his. He has so many incredible quotes, and I encourage also the dear friends to study his life and read his books. Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. This is a wonderful quote from Martin Luther King Jr. And before I segue to showing you these things that I have here on my desk, I encourage you also to watch another movie on Netflix. It's called Just Look Up. I don't know if it just came out. It's a wonderful movie. And why I bring it up is because humanity often...
It's don't look up.
Don't look up. Don't look up. Excellent. Thank you, dear John. Don't look up. It's because often we are blind and we just follow either leaders blindly, whatever they say. In that movie, there was a comet coming to destroy the whole planet. And the scientists, the great scientists, are trying to alert the world. The world is in danger. The world is in danger. Wake up, wake up. But what did he do? They politicize it and create division and factions and whatever. And eventually, the materialism of the organizations collaborate with the leaders and create a situation where eventually the whole world is destroyed. It's very similar to, I was actually considering bringing this movie up at the end of our Advent of Divine Justice presentation, and where Baha'u'llah is now, and in the very end of the Advent of Divine Justice is the warnings coming from Baha'u'llah. And I was thinking that Baha'u'llah is very much similar to this scientist, warning humanity, warning everyone, telling the peoples of the world, follow, listen, listen. If not, it will be your demise. Listen, listen. But they're not listening. But what happens? They say, hey, this person he's a false prophet. He's making these things up. He's not. And so what happens? They're not listening. And that's why this is the day of days. And we are meeting, what is the term? Divine justice. Because now we are entering the days of divine justice because they have failed to listen. It was just an interesting observation from a different angle as I was watching that movie. Thank you very much, dear John. So I also wanted to share this personal experience. When I was making this presentation, it took me 1 year, and you probably see why. It's a long presentation covering the Advent of Divine Justice very detailed. And as I was putting it together, my wife said, Ehsan, let's go for a weekend down to the beach area in South Texas, okay? So I was like, okay, we'll go down. And we drove down, and my wife said, Ehsan, it's a pretty long drive. Let's just stop. I think there's an antique store, and you like antiques. Let's stop. So I stopped. This is just like any day in Texas, pretty much any day. And I walk in, and I was looking at different antiques. And as I'm looking around, the Advent of Divine Justice is foremost still on my mind. And when I think about things, it's still there, right? And as I'm walking through this store, I just happened to see something, little thing, and I was like, it's kind of weird. What is that? And I looked closer, and it was this little guy. You see that? Just look, there's this guy. And it was this little racist doll kind of thing. And he was this little racist doll with this sombrero. Oh, you can't see it? Can you see it?
Nope. I just still see the quote of it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll stop sharing so you can see me. Sorry.
Thank you.
There, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so that's what it is. This little guy right here, okay? And I was just holding him, and I looked at it, and I was like, he has this sombrero hat to mix two cultures, the Hispanics and the African Americans. And you could see his face is just happy, smiley face, no details. And this was extremely common back then, no distinctive features. And I was like, wow, I was totally caught off seeing this. Then I started my, as they say, the new race of men coming up in paragraphs 28, 48, and 115 in Advent of Divine Justice, that we should have new eyes when we see the world. And I was thinking, okay, let me change my eyes. Let me think, maybe this store is a very racist store. When I walk into a store, that's not the first thing I think. Maybe the store is very racist. So suddenly I flipped and I said, maybe the store is very racist. Let me look around. And then I started seeing artifact after artifact all through the store. This is another one. Little kids on a watermelon. And why they have watermelon is because if you just look up the history of this, after 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, one of the only things that African Americans were allowed, here's another one, little kids with a watermelon. There's so many. Yeah. One of the only jobs that they were allowed, little kid with a watermelon. So many. I mean, and these are toys, right? These are toys for children. And you can see the face. So barely any detail. So why they did with watermelon is because it was one of the only jobs that African Americans were allowed to get into after slavery had ended. So there's a little kid holding a little blanket, covering his mouth, to show like, oh, I'm so innocent, but really belittling them, right? And so there was, here's another doll, just no description on the face, just this smiling, And this is very common. And then if you look at the white dolls, great detail, very well made. And these are all wooden so that you can't hug them. There's no love in them. They're just hard wooden dolls. Then, because the only job that the African Americans could get into and make a little bit of money was watermelon making. But then they realized, hey, these African Americans are starting to make money. So let's make fun of them. Let's make fun of them, And so another one of them was mammy dolls. Mammy dolls. This is a mammy doll. Call your servant over, your mammy. There's a little doll with a bell, and on it says New Orleans. You can see it there. So this is in the South, where I live in South. This is a mammy doll, quite common. This was a duster. The bottom part of the duster is off. So this would sit here, and this is a duster. And she's eating a watermelon. You can see watermelon here. So this would sit on your counter. I mean, it's just so much stuff. I mean, the amount, and these are all toys, right? Of that period and that generation to teach this racist ideology. I didn't want to get too much into it, but what I'm saying is, just like how Nazi Germany managed to teach Nazism to their children, this was part and parcel for years on years on years. These per se evil weapons were children toys to teach their children this ideology of racism. And yeah, my little children, I have 3 children, and 2 of them at that time were 3 and 6. And they saw Daddy buying toys, and they were like, Daddy, can I have one of them? I was like, no, these are evil, and you're not going to touch them, and they're going to stay in my closet. And that was it, because these were designed to teach hate. And that's the reality. These were designed to teach hate. So really, that's all I wanted to share, that this is not some like long ago, hundreds of years ago thing. This is me just driving down the street and picking up something from the store. You see that? So this is not like, this is, I just found this the other day, as they say, So I wanted to share that this is a much, much more recent problem that is still a manifestation of the history of racism in this country. Okay. Any thoughts on that? The sharing, I wanted to just share that because that was personal as we've been talking about the history of race and racism. Any thoughts on on what I just shared, or before we move on to the last part?
Interested that I saw just recently, my wife, this past week, I couldn't find it just now, but there was a shopkeeper who had people who sold collectibles and things like that, and might have Aunt Jemima or might have other things. And she has something in the contract, not disallowing any of the sales like that. So it was, some of those things were very collectibles, and they refused. She had something in her contract saying that shopkeepers could not have that. So that was at least one step up. The fact that they were selling them was sad, but
sure. I mean, once I realized that store was just filled top to, with everything, and it was strategically placed, so you wouldn't notice it that easy, unless your mind was attuned to it. And when I noticed it, I was like, oh, okay, this is very interesting. And I acted like I was on the other side, as they say. So I wanted to see how far was she going, on the extremities of racism. She was like, Ehsan, come over to my house. I have the good stuff there, And I was like, whoa, my gosh. And so that was like, really amazing. And that this is still very much still entrenched in the culture in the South and in the United States fabric. And that's why, in the words of the beloved guardian, this is the corrosion has set in. And so that's why I wanted to share this, even though these toys might be from 40s or 50s or earlier, whatever, but still, it's still embraced, it's still accepted, it's still part of society. So that's all I wanted to share on that. So let's finish up this part and we can continue. Okay, excellent. So now we're transitioning to paragraph 52. So all of that incredible study was really based upon that one paragraph 51. Now we're transitioning to paragraph 52. Okay, now the beloved guardian is now presenting his first solution to racism. And he first presents the example of Abdu'l-Baha. This is what he does. He says, in dealing with racial prejudice, the beloved guardian counsels the North American Bahá'ís in paragraph 52 to remember the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha. In fact, dear friends, he uses the example of Abdu'l-Baha not once, but twice in regards to racial prejudice. He brings it up again in paragraph 58. So this is not, and he uses the example of Abdu'l-Baha. So we have to look to the example of Abdu'l-Baha so much. Whenever the issue of racism comes up, we immediately should look to his example. We should look to his example and how Abdu'l-Baha visited the friends, his courage, his genuine love, his contempt for and impatience of criticism, tempered by his tact and wisdom. The beloved guardian then asked the Bahá'ís to revive and perpetuate the events in which he demonstrated. These are the qualities Abdu'l-Baha demonstrated: his keen sense of justice, spontaneous sympathy for the downtrodden, sense of the oneness of the human race, his overflowing love for its members, and his displeasure with those who dared to flout his wishes, deride his methods, or challenge his principles, or to nullify his acts. Look at me, follow me, be as I am. I believe it's 9 words here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 words. Look at me, follow me, be as I am. 3 counsels there. And this short little command from Abdu'l-Baha. Look at me. We should look. How do you look at Abdu'l-Baha? You have to study his teachings. Study his example. Study his life. Look at him. Really, genuinely look at him. Look at his teachings. Look at his life. Look at his example. Who is Abdu'l-Baha? And the more you study, then you follow him. You need to bring it home. You got to bring it internally, follow him, try to emulate him. Then be as I am. This is where you have now taken it to the highest level of transformation. To be as I am. You're transforming. This is the transformation that is needed. This is from the Supreme Body, the Universal House of Justice, their letter 22nd July 2020. Ahead of you lie times of trial and promise, of hardship and progress, of anguish and joy. Under all conditions, the Master is your solace and support for those who aspire to lasting change. Then the Supreme Body quotes his example. This is what they say. His example guides the way, tactful and wise in his approach, penetrating in utterance, indiscriminating in fellowship, unfailing in sympathy for the downtrodden, courageous in conduct, persevering in action, imperturbable in the face of tests, unwavering in his keen sense of justice. And to all who arise to emulate him, he offers this unfailing assurance. That which is confirmed is the oneness of the world of humanity. Every soul who serveth this oneness will undoubtedly be assisted and confirmed. And this letter specifically, the 22nd July 2020 letter, is directly addressed in the spirit of, on the subject of racial and racism prejudices. So this is the last paragraph here is in regards to turn towards the example of Abdu'l-Baha, turn towards his example. So when Abdu'l-Baha was in America, he did amazing things. And he also, the individuals that he met and transformed were incredible souls. And one of these souls that he met was this beautiful soul, Hand of the Cause of God, Louis Gregory. In 1911, His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha invited a well-known African-American Baha'i, Louis Gregory, to visit him. And during the visit, Abdu'l-Baha stressed to Louis Gregory the significance of race unity and of bringing together white and Black Americans. Louis Gregory traveled to Egypt, where Abdu'l-Baha was staying at the time. He then visited the Baha'i holy places in Palestine, and Gregory recalls, Abdu'l-Baha said many wonderful things during my brief contact with him in Egypt, which lasted less than a fortnight. But more than anything else, his discourse was about the American race problem. Abdu'l-Baha could have talked about anything. I mean, it's Abdu'l-Baha, come on, right? But he chose to speak about the American race problem. After the pilgrimage, Abdu'l-Baha continued to urge Gregory to work for unity and harmony between the races. His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha encouraged the marriage of Gregory and the white English Baha'i, Louisa A.M. Matthew, who visited Abdu'l-Baha in 1911, at the same time as Gregory. She also traveled with Abdu'l-Baha to America on his invitation. And when Gregory and Louisa met again in America, Abdu'l-Baha urged them to consider their relationship in a new light. I love this, Abdu'l-Baha, the matchmaker, you know, so beautiful. And this transformed their friendship into love, and they married on the 27th September 1912 in New York City. They became the first interracial Baha'i couple at a time when there were scientific arguments against mixing of races through miscegenation. So there was, we've talked about all those anti-miscegenation laws that were in effect. And this was the first 1912. I mean, come on. I mean, it was not till the 60s that it was outlawed, all of these miscegenation laws. There were even anti-miscegenation laws enforced in over half of the American states. His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha deplored the racial segregation prevalent in the United States and strongly urged the Friends to associate with each other in the utmost joy and happiness. He called for such a gathering, and it took place Wednesday, April 17th at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Kinney. And here are the Kinneys sitting with their dog, where Baha'is and their friends of both the black and the white races met in unity. He prepared and served the meal himself, speaking of the human family as a garden of flowers of various hues. The master was most happy, and the spirit of the Friends was high. It was felt that this was a landmark in the city, and this memorable event was followed by a public address at the hotel. Here's Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha arrived in Montclair, New Jersey on Friday, June 21st, 1912, staying in a house he had rented in advance. Most of his time was occupied in talking with the people who came to see him. On Sunday morning, June 23rd, 1912, Abdu'l-Baha told the Baha'is more of the history of the faith. And as he came into the living room where the people were gathered, he said to one of the incoming friends, "You are always smiling." Mr. Frank E. Osborne replied, "Surely our faces should reflect happiness in this presence." Abdu'l-Baha replied, "Yes, this is the day of Baha'u'llah, the age of the blessed perfection, the cycle of the greatest name. If you do not smile now, for what time will you await, and what greater happiness could you expect?" I love that. That's why I included it, even though it's not per se directly talking about the oneness of humanity. I include that just because we should be so happy. This is the day of the blessed His Holiness Baha'u'llah. Abdu'l-Baha left Montclair at 8:30 a.m. on Saturday, June 29th, and after transferring to 4 different streetcars, arrived at Roy Wilhelm's house in West Englewood, New Jersey. This was the large outdoor gathering, the Unity Feast, to which Abdu'l-Baha had invited the Friends before he left New York. Addressing the entire group, he said, "This is a new day, and this hour is a new hour in which we have come together. True Baha'i meetings are the mirrors of the kingdom, wherein images of the supreme concourse are reflected. First, you must become united and agreed among yourselves." When he had finished, the meal was ready, but just as it was announced, thunder was heard, and large raindrops began to fall. Abdu'l-Baha walked to the road, taking a chair, and several friends grouped around him. As he sat, his face turned upward. A strong wind began to blow, the clouds began to disperse, and the sun shone through. Then he rose and walked back into the grove. After the meal of Persian food, Abdu'l-Baha anointed the 250 guests with attar of roses. After dark, as the friends sat on the lawn with candles, Abdu'l-Baha spoke, ending as he walked into the darkness, "Peace be with you. I will pray for you." On the glorious day set aside for this unique gathering, friends, neighbors and strangers from the east, west, north and south, rich and poor, white and black, all one in the spirit, truly a marvelous demonstration. This is 1912, a gathering of 250 people from every walk of life, truly historic and amazing. Some of the people present that day included Bertha Clark, Mary Ford, Sylvia Gannett, Maud Gaddu, Lua Getzinger, Mrs. Gertrude Harris, Mr. Hooper Harris, Bertha Herklotz, Ali Kuli Khan, Florence Khan, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Kinney, Florian Krug, Marjorie Morton, Grace Ober, Grace Robarts, Martha Root, Charlotte Segler, Erwin Smith, Juliet Thompson, Neville Thomas, Amalia Tyler, Roy Wilhelm, and his mother, and many more, too numerous to mention. About 450 persons were gathered. Here's a picture of this Unity Feast, 1912. You can see His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha right here. So carrying on, dear Scott, if you could so kindly read this slide, and we're getting almost to the end of our session. We're almost done with this topic. Go for it.
Abdu'l-Bahá in Washington, D.C. Racial prejudice was in its heyday in the Washington of 1912. Even the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community of that day was not immune to its deadly virus. His Holiness Abdu'l-Bahá openly challenged the status quo in words and deeds. Speaking at Howard University, an all-Black institution, he said, "If the heart is pure, white or black, or any color makes no differences. God does not look at colors, he looks at the heart." And in the newspaper, it said, Baha'i leader at Howard University, head of Oriental religious sect, delivers lecture to the student body.
Excellent. Thank you, dear Scott. So this is His Holiness Abdu'l-Bahá is now visiting the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community, and he's speaking at Howard University. Says, today the master went to Howard University, an educational institution for Blacks. The hosts, mostly Blacks with a few whites, had made special arrangements so that when the master arrived, he was welcomed by music from a band while the audience applauded with excitement and exuberance. It is difficult to describe the scene adequately. The president of the university was very cordial and introduced Abdu'l-Bahá as the prophet of peace and the harbinger of unity and salvation. Then the master rose from his seat and spoke on the subject of the harmony between Blacks and whites and the unity of humankind. The audience repeatedly applauded him during the talk, delighted at his words. At the conclusion, the president of the university thanked Abdu'l-Bahá on behalf of all those gathered. As he left the auditorium, group after group formed two lines, one on each side, all showing their highest respect by bowing and waving their hats and handkerchiefs in farewell to the beloved master. This is the hall that the students were gathered near Minor Hall at Howard University. And this is the president that introduced and welcomed His Holiness Abdu'l-Bahá. Wilbur P. Thurkild, he was the president of Howard University, and introduced Abdu'l-Bahá April 23rd, 1912. This is all coming from Agnes Parsons' diary, Abdu'l-Bahá in America, from her diary. On Tuesday, after seeing several people in the morning, Abdu'l-Bahá and Dr. Farid went for a short drive, stopped at Mr. and Mrs. Hannin's house. Afterward, they went to Howard University, where Abdu'l-Bahá made an address before a large audience of professors and students. He dwelt largely upon the need of love and unity between the white and Black races, and spoke of the gratitude which the colored people should feel for the whites, because through them came not only freedom from their race, but it was the beginning of freedom for all slaves. He also told through education the differences between the two races would be lessened. On Tuesday, April 23rd at noon, Abdu'l-Bahá addressed the student body of more than 1,000, the faculty, and a large number of distinguished guests at Howard University. This was a most notable occasion, and here, as everywhere, when both white and colored people were present, Abdu'l-Bahá seemed happiest. The address was received with breathless attention by the vast audience and was followed by a positive ovation and a recall. That evening, the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, the leading colored organization in Washington, was addressed, and again the audience taxed the capacity of the edifice in which the meeting was held. So here's a clipping of that exact event. Baha'i leader at the Howard University, head of Oriental religious sect, delivers lecture to the student body. And it says, freedom here brought freedom elsewhere. The effect of freedom in this country reacted all over the world. So this is the exact clipping. We don't have to read it, but this is was extracts from his talk. We're just a few, maybe one or two more slides, and then we conclude for today. At an all-whites luncheon where many of the glitterati of Washington society were present, Abdu'l-Baha suddenly stood up, looked all around, and said to his host, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring Mr. Gregory." The host rushed to get Louis Gregory, who was no doubt thought to be one of the blacks serving those present as the table. Mr. Gregory was brought to the head of the table and seated in the place of honor at Abdu'l-Baha's right. In Washington, His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha asserted that harmony between the black and white races would be an assurance of world peace. So before we get to the last slide in this presentation on this subject right here, I just want you to ponder on what His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha did by calling Mr. Gregory. Because this, remember, it says, dwell on the life of Abdu'l-Baha. Look to the example of Abdu'l-Baha. What did he do there? In that time, in that culture, African Americans in 1912, sure, they had been liberated by the 13th Amendment. They were not slaves, but they were still servants. They were still considered, second and third class citizens in the United States. They were not considered on any level equal. But what did Abdu'l-Baha do? He immediately saw that Louis Gregory was not even in the same room. So he called Mr. Gregory to the room. He said, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring him in." This was of a shock. The host rushed to bring Louis Gregory in because they considered him a servant. They didn't see him as one of the honored guests. Abdu'l-Baha instructed him to sit at his right as an honored guest and placed him there. So this is a quote that I want the friends to think about, because this is a very powerful quote as Baha'is when we talk about unity in the community, true unity in the community. We have to look to the example of Abdu'l-Baha and think about this. Diversity is having a seat at the table, okay? Just like Louis Gregory, he had a seat at the table. But inclusion is having a voice, and belonging is having that voice be heard. Abdu'l-Baha did all of these things in one stroke, in one movement. He brought that diversity to his table. He said, "Come here, bring him in." He included him by placing him there at his right. He brought him in by giving him a voice at the table. And then he gave him that sense of belonging. He was at the right hand of Abdu'l-Baha. You see, now that, my dear friends, when we are told to champion racial justice as Baha'is by bringing diversity, and when we get to paragraph 82, where His Holiness, the beloved guardian, is now addressing inclusion, bringing diversity, racial diversity to our communities. We're only on paragraph 52 right now, but when we get to 82, the guardian now wants to create community enrichment through diversity. And if you recall last year, that pivotal document, Call to Action, where the National Spiritual Assembly was calling on all the communities to enrich their communities with African Americans and Native Americans, Call to Action. This is really how to do it. Bring them in. Be proactive. Do not say, "Oh, yeah, I have an African American friend. I have a lot of, I talk to them once a, What are you doing to bring them in? Proactively, lovingly, genuinely, and going out of your way. As His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha says, he says, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Be different, be unique, be brave." And use that example of his Abdu'l-Baha. Bring it to mind. So, dear friends, there we are. Part 14 done. Okay, that was covering paragraphs 51 and 52. Next week I'm out, but our dear John and Jeremiah will pick up. And this is now historic time. I mean, this is the first time that we're going to be at the same time as Martin Luther King weekend, going into the section, which is also the Baha'i approach to racism. And so it's what an incredible time that we're entering into the next paragraph sequence. So during that next weekend, we're going to be going into the Baha'i approach to racism and racial prejudice. How do we go about doing it? And so dear John and Jeremiah will have the slides and everything. So I will take, you guys will be honored to be learning and listening from that. So thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions before we transition to our prayer for the Southern states, don't hesitate. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everyone. And dear John and Jeremiah, as always, thank you to both of you guys. And always good to see our loyal followers, from Scott to Linda and to all of you guys. Thank you so much for, as they say, putting up with us and being stout supporters. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ehsan, for all your effort. Oh my God, thou seest me in my lowliness and weakness, occupied with the greatest undertaking, determined to raise thy word among the masses and to spread thy teachings among thy peoples. How can I succeed unless thou assist me with the breath of the Holy Spirit? Help me to triumph by the hosts of thy glorious kingdom, and shower upon me thy confirmations, which alone can change a gnat into an eagle, a drop of water into rivers and seas, and an atom into lights and suns. O my Lord, assist me with thy triumphant and effective might, so that my tongue may utter thy praises and attributes among all people, and my soul overflow with the wine of thy love and knowledge. Thou art the omnipotent and the doer of whatsoever thou willest. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.